Hello, 7th graders. This is Mrs. Grady, and welcome to your study guide for your last test. It says it's a final on the page, but it's really just the last test for 7th grade. Okay, so this test will cover the elements of fiction, so we'll do a quick review of that. We've talked about that all year, at least for Touching Spiritbearer and for this last unit of short stories. So this is something we'll talk about again next year in 8th grade, but this will just be the last thing that we do for 7th grade English. Okay, so to review the elements of fiction, there's a couple of different definitions that I want you to be able to remember. You may use notes for this test. That's totally fine with me. So anything that you want to write down to be able to use on your final test, any of these definitions, is totally fine to use on the test. You don't have to try to do it from memory. Use your resources for this. Okay. So definitions. The plot is the way a story develops, a series of actions or events the characters go through. So that would be a matching definition for your test. Setting, the time and place where the events in the story occur. Point of view. Most of you did this just fine on your worksheet for your short stories, but we didn't really have a chance to review this before you went and did your short stories. Probably something I should have done. But I want you to know for point of view is it's the perspective from which a literary work or a story is told. So first person would be the narrator is a character who is part of the action and uses first person pronouns such as I, me, my. So when you've got an I voice describing what's going on in the story, that's first person point of view. Third person point of view is when the narrator is someone outside of the action rather than a character in the story. The narrator describes what is happening but is not part of the story. So most of the stories, in fact, all of the stories that you read for the short story unit were from third person point of view. There wasn't any first person short stories that we read for these 4 short stories. The one exception to that rule was The Lady or the Tiger, which does change point of view in the end of the story, but you're not going to need to know that for your test. Okay, the theme is the message that the author is trying to communicate. A lot of times we boil this down to an idiom like don't judge a book by its cover, or look before you leap. So it's usually something that is like a moral of the story sometimes, but themes, there can be more than one theme in a story. Themes can be more complex than just an idiom, so they can involve more than just don't judge a book by its cover. There might be more to it than that, but a theme is, at its very basic form, is the message or the moral of the story. Okay, what is a short story? We read 4 of them. A shorter piece of writing intended to be read in one sitting that produces one strong effect and has a limited number of characters. So The Lady or the Tiger, it's a short story. It's not a lot of pages. You can read it in one sitting as long as you're focused, right? There Will Come Soft Rains, not a long story. Harris and Bergeron and All Summer in a Day, very short stories, not something that's going to take you a long time to read. Okay, so the characters in the story are someone who takes part in the action of a narrative or story. Usually these are people. Sometimes in other stories they might be animals. In There Will Come Soft Rains, we have a different character because there aren't any actually living people in the story. It takes place after they've already passed away from the explosion or the nuclear catastrophe. And so in There Will Come Soft Rains, the character is actually the house, the mechanical house, and the mechanical things that are in the house. The dog that dies in the house could be considered a character as well. All of the other stories that we read have just actual human characters. There's 2 types of characters that are possible in a story. We didn't really talk about that this year, and I'm not going to ask you a question about this, but it's on the study guide. Those are dynamic and static. We'll talk more about that next year. That won't be on your test, so don't worry about that part. A conflict in a story is the struggle between opposing forces. We talked about that with Touching Spiritbearer a little bit, so this kind of goes back to the beginning of the year. There's 4 types of conflict that can happen in a story. Character versus character. So, for example, in Harris and Bergeron, we've got a character that is the sort of government figure in the story that's trying to capture Harrison. You've got his mom and dad that are kind of against him, so you've got quite a bit of character versus character there. In All Summer in a Day, you've got the character versus character conflict because the children are mean to Margot. When they lock her in the closet, they're hurting her, so it's a character versus character situation. Really doesn't happen. There's no character versus character in There Will Come Soft Rains. It's more character versus nature, or the house versus nature, because nature's slowly overtaking the house again now that the humans are gone. So that one's kind of a different story that way. You've got character versus character in The Lady or the Tiger. You've actually got all 4 types of conflict in the Lady or the Tiger, because you've got the king who is persecuting or trying the young man in the arena. You've got the princess versus the young man. And then you have the young man is potentially going to be eaten by a tiger, so that's character versus nature. The young man is being tried by the justice system in this kingdom, so that's character versus society. And then the princess is debating with herself as to what she's going to direct, like which direction she's going to indicate for the young man, which door to open. So that's her versus herself. So all 4 types of conflict appear in The Lady or the Tiger. Okay, here's the parts of a short story, parts of any story, that we've been talking about all year. The first part of the story is exposition, the beginning of the story. It introduces the characters, setting, and basic situation of the story. The rising action is on that upswing of the chart. Begins with the inciting incident, which we've talked about all year. During the rising action, the conflict experiences complication and grows more intense. Again, the inciting incident, which we've talked about with all the stories we've read this year, is the moment or situation that begins the major problem of the story. So that is that, and that happens right at the end of the exposition, right here where the base of the plot mountain is, right where my mouse is right now. Okay, then the climax is at the very peak of our plot mountain at the top there. Okay, and the definition of climax is the moment or situation in which the major problem of a story ends or is resolved. So it's the moment that wraps up the inciting incident. So whatever the problem is that's introduced in the inciting incident is resolved in some way in the climax of the story. It's where everything comes to an exciting, sometimes just wraps things up, conclusion of some kind. In a lot of stories, it's the major battle or conflict between the opposing forces. Think Avengers, where Thanos is battled for the last time and Iron Man takes him on. That would be a climax of the story. Falling action, everything that happens after the climax. So in our chart, oops, a little too far there. Okay, so in the falling action on the chart is this side of the plot mountain on the downswing. Okay, and the falling action is everything that happens after the climax. So everything winds down. Any little complications that are not part of the major problem are usually resolved or at least talked about. And then finally, at the very end, we have the resolution, or the denouement is what that's called sometimes. It's the end of the story, the conflict is resolved, all the loose ends are tied up, hopefully, and that's the end of the story. Okay, so The Lady or the Tiger was one that you filled out a worksheet for. Here are the characters in the story. We have the semi-barbaric king, his daughter, the princess, the young man who fell in love with the princess and is now on trial. We've got the lady who's behind the door. One of the doors. And we have an audience or spectators in the story, which technically includes the reader, since the reader is being asked to kind of observe all those things. You could technically consider the tiger a character as well. But yeah, don't worry too much about the tiger. Okay. What does the king build and why did he build it? This goes to the plot of the story and the setting. The king built a large arena in order to try to execute justice in his kingdom by putting those accused of crimes on trial. So there's this entire setup. There's a little bit of complicated language in that section where it talks about how the king created this arena because he was trying to be more advanced and sophisticated than the barbaric neighbors around him. So instead of just executing people for doing bad things, he puts them in this sort of semi-authentic trial system where their guilt or innocence is determined by which door they choose. So it's not a perfect system, and it's not really even a great system, because it really doesn't get to the point of whether the person is guilty or innocent. It's just sort of random chance. But the king is considering this to be an advancement and to be something that makes him very sophisticated, because he does more than just kills people if they're accused of crimes. Okay, number 3, who's put on trial in the story and why? The young man is put on trial. He falls in love with the princess, and he's put on trial because he's a commoner, and he shouldn't have anything to do with the princess. So he's not a prince, he's not royalty, he shouldn't be falling in love with the princess, and yet he does. So he, because he was caught, essentially, is put on trial for the crime of loving someone above his station. Okay, 4, what are the 2 possible outcomes for this character? He has a choice between 2 doors. Behind one door is the vicious tiger who's going to eat him if he opens that door. And behind the other door is the beautiful lady who he will be married to immediately. So again, not a great system of justice because it's completely chance whether or not he picks one or the other. And it's not necessarily like, supposedly if he chooses the lady, he's innocent. If he chooses the tiger, he's guilty. But if he really loves the princess, choosing the lady really isn't a great outcome for him either. Alright, and then last, what does the princess choose for this character? It's unknown which of the fates he chooses for the princess chooses for the young man. The story tells us that she indicates the door on the right for him, but it doesn't tell us which choice that leads him to. It's left ambiguous at the end of the story. We don't know whether he chose the lady or the tiger. You can make an argument for either side. You can find evidence in the story that says, of course she sent him to the tiger because she didn't want to have to share him with the other lady. Or, well, of course, because she loved him, even though she had to give him up by sending him to the lady, she still sent him to the lady. So it just depends on how you view the princess, how you view the young man, how you view the situation, as to which outcome you think happened. But it's left that way intentionally because we just don't know, what his destiny was, what his outcome was. And it just shows how imperfect this justice system is, because he could be guilty or innocent, and he's really not guilty of anything, so to speak, except for loving the princess. So his fate is determined by something completely random and doesn't really prove his guilt or innocence either way. Okay, I'm going to talk about There Will Come Soft Rains, and then it looks like I'm going to run out of time for this screencast, so I'm going to go ahead and make a second video that'll talk about our last 2 stories, Harrison Bergeron and All Summer in a Day. Okay, but for There Will Come Soft Rains, we have the characters in the story. The automated house is technically a character, even though it's not a human. It's sort of alive. What's really interesting about this story to me is that the author, Ray Bradbury, is a science fiction writer, and he wrote this story in the 1950s. So this is really before any of this was even possible. I mean, now we look at the story, and all of the things that are talked about in the story are completely possible in a modern house. You can have Alexa tell you what time it is. You could have a Roomba going around the house cleaning it up. But none of those things were possible when Ray Bradbury wrote the story. So it's really a very fascinating story that he wrote about the future that's now completely possible. Fortunately for us, even though the year in the story is 2026, which is not too far from our own time, we're not looking at the specter of nuclear war, which is what's happened at this house. So we have the starving dog. There's no humans around to feed him, and he wanders into the house and dies. It's rather sad, but unfortunately, the dog does die, and the house sort of cleans him up, sends him to the incinerator. He's dealt with. Then you have the mechanical mice in the house who clean up, and they're not actually present, but there's the absent family who used to live in the house. We know that they're gone, that they're dead from this explosion, because there's on the side of the house, it describes how their shadows are sort of the explosion caused their shadows to be their outlines to be left on the side of the house. So we know that they're gone. We know that they're dead. Some kind of explosion happened. Mrs. Tisdale isn't there anymore or I don't remember if that's the family name. The lady of the house isn't there to listen to her poetry anymore. The kids aren't there anymore. So everything's gone, and it's because of this nuclear disaster. Okay, I'm going to run out of time on this screencast, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is finish this, starting with the setting of the story in a second part to this study guide. Okay, so I'm going to end this here, and then I'll have a part 2 also uploaded. All right, just a second, guys.